Evidence Not Seen by Darlene Deibler Rose. I came down with dengue fever, but knowing that the rash would not appear until the 5th day, I caught the next steamer for Makassar. When the cabin boy opened my door, he saw what appeared to be a bad case of smallpox. With a gasp, he slammed the door shut and disappeared. Some hours later, the first officer came to see me. Recognizing the symptoms of dengue fever, he said I should remain in the cabin until the rash disappeared. He sent my meals to me, and I was quite recovered before docking in Makassar. Dr. Jaffrey had been very ill during my absence. He had been in a coma for several hours. The local doctor diagnosed a peculiar type of malaria. This seemed to be the coverall for any illness the doctors weren't sure of. Dr. Jaffrey was much better, but he was remaining at Bingting until stronger. Margaret Jaffrey and I joined the other missionaries in Bingting for the remainder of the school holidays. Very late on the night of September 3rd, 1939, we were startled awake by insistent knocking on the door. It was a Dutch patrol officer and his aide with the news that an hour earlier England and France had declared war on Germany. Holland mobilized her troops in the motherland. However, she hoped to remain neutral as in World War I. If she were drawn into the European conflict, what of the Indies? Would the surrounding British and French colonies and possessions bring the war to the Far East? Precautions were being taken, and the marine planes serving the expedition in New Guinea were withdrawn to Java. Government officials in Anartali were ordered to be prepared to abandon the post and proceed to the coast at a moment's notice. The American consul ordered all Americans to have their passports up to date. From that time on, the conflict in Europe was never far from our thoughts and constantly in our prayers. In late September, I had returned, as had the other missionaries, to our ministries in Makassar, when a cable came from the mission's consul in Java assuring Dr. Jaffrey that permission to use the mission's plane in New Guinea would be granted immediately. Dr. Jaffrey broke the wonderful news to me as soon as he heard. "Do you need some help packing, lassie?" "Thank you, Dr. Jaffrey, but this being the 8th time I've packed and unpacked in the last few months, I'm quite adept at it." I packed with alacrity and care. Cardboard boxes would be used for transport by air. In the sultry weather, I had to check the boxes daily for mildew and vermin. Cardboard was no protection against the ever-present rats and cockroaches. The promised permit to use our plane in New Guinea never came. So a few weeks later, I returned the few things I had chosen to take with me to New Guinea to the 5 metal trunks of wedding gifts. Handling the beautiful gifts was always a time of remembering our dear families and the multitude of wonderful friends God had given Russell and me. As long as the plane permit was held up and the trail was the only means of reaching the interior, our wedding gifts would remain in the trunks with a liberal supply of roach and rat killer. In October, while Mr. Post was in Ambon, Russell and 3 Dayak carriers explored the newly discovered Kemendoro Valley to the east of the Whistle Lakes, which had an estimated population of 20,000. After 3 days, the police patrol that Russell accompanied aborted its plans. But rather than suffer defeat, Russell continued with his 3 carriers, and for several days they traveled through mud up to their knees, often falling waist deep into it. Many days a stream bed served as their trail. The Moni people welcomed Russell and the Dayaks and brought fruit and vegetables to them. The day before they headed back toward the Whistle Lakes, Russell traveled to the eastern limits of Moni land with Moni boys as guides, allowing the Dayaks to rest. Standing atop a very high mountain, he gazed into a labyrinth of valleys, mountains, and passes, and wondered how many other tribes were locked in beyond where his eyes could see. He felt a bit like Abraham overlooking Canaan, who heard God say, "Lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it." Genesis 13:14-15. Russell heard the Lord speak to him on that high place. "Other sheep I have, them also I must bring. Yes, there were many more undiscovered tribes and much land to be possessed. While Russell continued to explore the uncharted areas, far from the news of the outside world, a German freighter flying a swastika lay at anchor in Makassar Harbor all of October and part of November. Were the Germans awaiting orders or just enjoying the pleasures and protection of a neutral port? We silently wondered. Again, Russell celebrated Christmas on the trail, while I was hundreds of miles away at Bentintingi with the Makassar missionaries. Russell and I had been apart for 7 more long months. The Jaffreys, Grace Dittmar, a newly arrived missionary, and I went caroling at 4 in the morning and awakened everyone on the hillside with our loud rendition of Joy to the World. Even as we sang, the wonder of God's great love seeped into all the crevices and voids of my inmost being, giving me strength to face the dark, looming clouds of war and further separation from Russell. A Christmas letter arrived just days after the holidays. Russell had accompanied the Dayaks to the coast to see them safely aboard the government steamer returning to Borneo. Their 6 months were over, and as they left, Russell wrote, "I shall miss them. We thank God for the Dayaks. We have worked with them side by side for so many months that I shall be lonely without them." The letter recounted his visit with the chieftain at Inaratali, Idantori, squatted in his hut, and listened attentively as Russell tried to explain the love of God and how Jesus had died for them. The chieftain was spiritually hungry. He admitted, but if Jesus had died for Russell, then he hadn't died for them. They were people, and Russell was a spirit, one who had come from the spirit world beyond the mountains. "I am not a spirit," Russell protested. Idantori, to prove his theory, took his Stone Age calendar off of the wall and began to count the rattan knots, 18 in all. The first knot had been tied when the patrol officer and the police arrived. Each knot thereafter represented the passing of each moon. "You arrived, and later others followed. You are all men," Idantori insisted. "None of you has a wife or children. If you are not spirits, who gave birth to you?" Russell countered, "But I told you before that I have a wife." "Where is she?" "Makassar," which to Idantori probably sounded like a good name for a spirit place. "Why has she not come here with you?" With a limited vocabulary, Russell found it difficult to explain permits and government regulations, so he lamely added, "Our chieftain says no." "If your chieftain is so bad in his stomach that he won't let your wives come, get rid of him," Idantori reasoned. "Many men have died on the trail," Russell protested, to which Idantori responded, "Then your wife would have made it. Wherever we go, the women follow and carry the loads." Idantori eventually concluded that if Russell were speaking the truth, and there was a wife so weak that she couldn't carry his supplies, then he would send Kapaku men down trail to help her. Meanwhile, others of the local tribe decided to learn firsthand if the government personnel were truly spirit people. They reasoned that if their arrows killed these intruders from beyond the mountains, they must be human. However, if the arrows passed through their bodies and they did not die, then they were spirits. A small government party that had gone across the lake was ambushed by several hundred natives. Some Kapakus were killed when the police opened fire in self-defense. "Lord," I prayed, "if those people are ever to believe and understand about you, women will have to go there." The moment I spoke those words, an assurance filled me. God spoke clearly in the silence. I threw the letter into the air and yelled, "I'm going to New Guinea!" Scooping up the pages, I dashed out to find Dr. Jaffrey. "Dr. Jaffrey, read this! I'm going to New Guinea!" "Lassie, I've known that for several days. I also had a letter from Russell giving his consent for you to go by trail. I've been waiting for the Lord to show you." Dr. Jaffrey and Margaret took me to the ship on January 23, 1940. Our belongings, packed as if by a seasoned professional, were stored below deck in the cargo hull. Dr. Jaffrey commended me into God's care. Then he said, "Remember, Lassie, for centuries the enemy has held these people in darkness. You will now experience satanic opposition such as you have never known. Until Russell's first trip, no one had ever invaded his territory to challenge him. But don't be afraid, for he is a defeated foe, undone by Calvary. Never forget that greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Pondering these words, I stood at the rail and waved until the ship moved out beyond the breakwater, and the Jaffreys were out of sight. They had become like a father and sister to me. I joined Viola Post in Ambon, where she had remained since her October visit with her husband. At the crack of dawn on February 5th, we were up and moving about, supplies carefully packed in tins or crated for repacking in Oeda were put on board. Then we embarked on the small government steamer. Almost every day we stopped at a different island to discharge cargo for remote government posts. Visiting these islands, tiny dots anchored by their coral moorings to the ocean floor, was like being transported into yesteryears of history. There was the ancient fort of Banda, built by the Dutch when they expelled the Portuguese in the early 1600s. An ancient cannon. Its ancient cannon, like a cyclopean eye in the crenellated structure, watched the harbor. The old churches evidenced the labors of early Dutch missionaries. A white linen cloth and silver communion service, over 100 years old, were lovingly cared for and still being used. The clove, nutmeg, mace, and coconut plantations were a delightful experience for my olfactory nerves. The marine gardens beneath the sea of this area were virtually unrivaled. I was most intrigued by the pearl fisheries. The Japanese divers were able to descend to amazing depths without the use of diving equipment. They were soon to be recalled to their homeland with in-depth information about the Banda and Seram seas in the surrounding islands. We were traveling at the worst time of the year in terms of the weather. The government boat was small. While rolling from side to side, it pitched into, onto, and off of the towering waves. Thank God I wasn't prone to seasickness. As we turned south and east along the neck of the island, the weather steadily deteriorated. We knew that unless there was a change for the better, we would not be disembarking at Oeda the following day. Because of a large sandbar guarding the mouth of the Oeda River, the government steamer had to drop anchor at considerable distance from shore. Lowering the cargo and passengers into lifeboats during a storm of this proportion was a risk the captain did not care to take. The alternative was to continue on to the next scheduled stop, Maruke, a government post near the border between Netherlands, New Guinea, and Papua. We were assured that there were no objections to our remaining on board. During the return trip, it would surely be calm, and they would be able to land us. The captain and officers were more than gracious, but there were so many factors involved that Viola and I were emboldened to ask the Lord's intervention. Our husbands would already have arrived on the coast. Because there was no radio in Oeda, it was impossible to inform them of any change in schedule. 2 of the evangelists and a contingent of Kapukas would be midway down the trail to wait at Orawaja. There was no way to turn them back. Housing and feeding so many on the coast would be expensive and a near impossibility. The danger of the Kapukas contracting malaria also had to be considered. Never before had they ventured to the coast. The urging to find out if we were spirit people or humans, like them, had moved them to volunteer for the treacherous trip. God was our only source of help. We prayed earnestly that he would still the wind and calm the troubled sea. By morning the sky had begun to clear, the wind to abate, and when we came abreast of Oeda, the ship dropped anchor in the glassiest sea I have ever seen in all my trips around the world. Today's seas are still subject to the Christ of Galilee. In about an hour and a half, we and our cargo were lowered into a lifeboat and transported aboard around the sandbar. Excitement mounted as I glimpsed Russell standing on the jetty. Once more we were to be together, this time in New Guinea.